Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with Nicola Smuts Allsop about fertility astrology and the process of using astrology in order to help with conception and having a child. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here.
Yeah. So you were here for the International Society for Astrological Research Conference. It's happening in Colorado just later this week, right?
Yes.
Okay. And we almost did this interview actually last time I was in London in 2019, but we just barely, I think, didn't cross paths. But I've been meaning to, since you published your book titled Fertility Astrology in 2017, right?
Yeah.
Or 2018?
I think the book came out in earlier 2016. No?
Okay.
But yeah, it was at the conference that we met, I think in 2018.
Right.
In America.
Yeah. All right. Great. Well, I'm excited about this topic. This is a topic that is actually a very big topic, and it's something that you've come to specialize in, but you actually started initially doing it as part of your early consultations, but then eventually it became actually like a personal thing for you yourself that you ended up applying to your own life, right?
It did. I must admit, it started off with one case, the first case, Amanda, where I made a very wild and naive prediction in my very early career. I basically hadn't really started practicing. And when you get something, a prediction that is so right and so perfect, it really scared the bejesus out of me. I thought, what is this astrology? And this is really... it was almost too much too soon. So I spent a lot of time unpacking that chart to find out what exactly was it that made me say that. And following Amanda's prediction in 2003, there were 7 other pregnancies that are predicted to the date in the next 6 months. So it was almost as if fertility astrology chose me and not the other way around. And I then decided to focus all of my efforts on finding material that I could use for that. Because, of course, then all the people who were suffering had heard about Amanda's story and they all came to me. And back in the day, and let's just remember that 2003 is quite some time ago now, there was very little in traditional writings, astrological writings. There was virtually nothing. I had to be a member of the Real Astrology Yahoo group, and the other one was, I can't remember the name, but anyway, it was a John Frawley split-off group. And those were the days when we had B-bar internet, and you had to ask your question, post your chart, but you would have had to have done some work yourself. And then you'd have to wait a whole day for people to reply to your email. And then you'd have a conversation about your chart. And like I said, in the absence of all the Schmidt Project Hindsight material, because that hadn't been finished or published yet, and in the absence of a lot of other Ben Dyke's work, everything that's come out now, it was really like very difficult to find those older texts that could give you some kind of basis for my kind of astrology that I wanted to practice. I did find the speaker publications, the Liber Hermetis, the Liber Hermetis. I think Robert Hand was involved with a translation of Etius Valens, Dorotheus of Sidon. They all came out through speaker publication, and they were most helpful. And I actually started there. That's where I started my research.
Okay, so the initial entryway for you was making a successful prediction about somebody having a child and then realizing that was possible, essentially.
Yes.
As well as several people having a child. And then eventually clients started coming to you with a actual problem where they were having problems conceiving or wanting to get advice for what the best times would be in order to attempt to have children.
Well, both. And we didn't realize it at the time, and I suppose it's quite apparent now, but 1 in 6 couples has trouble with infertility. So regardless of what kind of astrology you practice, 1 in 6 couples in your practice is going to ask you the question one day, we're really struggling to have children. Can you tell me when I'm going to have them?
Right. That's a huge number, 1 in 6.
It is. It's startling. So So that's where it started. And I think Cape Town, where I was practicing at the time, is a relatively small place. And I think once word got out about that, obviously I had all the people who couldn't get pregnant, and part of their consult with me was to talk that people who are struggling with infertility, they find the need to explain a lot and to tell the story. And so there was a lot of note-taking in those days, and a lot of medical histories. I mean, there are a few components to fertility that I started comparing to actual sort of astrology myths, if you like, or actual astrology signatures. So I realized pretty early on that, okay, in the woman's charts, we need hormones. We need a uterus, we need eggs. And that basically, and the ascendant will tell you what the uterus is like, because it's the ship that you sail in. It's a physical body, and the moon will tell you the quantity of eggs, the quality of eggs through the aspects of the moon, and the hormones are going to be any negative aspect or positive aspects from Neptune. And how does that, and sometimes to Venus. So we get a moon Venus can also be a hormonal thing. So I listened to all their stories. I started tracking all of their complaints, and using the symbolism in astrology that I already knew, I kind of worked out, okay, so these people with Moon Neptune or Moon Venus, I'm going to maybe go with thyroid or endocrine problems. If the moon is ruled by Saturn conjunct Saturn, I'm going to go with low ovarian reserve. And so I started building up a database, if you like, of anecdotal evidence, for want of a better word, and then I would also talk them through the psychological aspect of that. So for me, it wasn't just about you've got moon conjunct Saturn, so you have low ovarian reserve. I would want to talk to them about, now interesting, the Liber Hermeta starts off with, if you have moon conjunct Saturn, then your mother is a slave. So just using that that's where I started, and I'm going, okay, now how can I reinterpret this into 2003? How can I make this useful? So then I'd go, okay, so my rejig of that was to say, well, it seems to me that you carry with you the narrative of not enough. So if we just concentrate there, I'd say to people, you don't feel like you have enough time, you don't feel like you have enough money, you don't feel like you have enough of emotional resource in order to do the things that you want to do. So even if you have masses of money, you still feel that on some level. Mm-hmm. And that stomatizes in the physical body and makes the body stingy in the production of eggs, because the eggs are precious, there's low ovarian reserve. And once people could make that connection, they would go, oh, okay, fine, so I'm now not going to resist going on Clomid or other sort of egg-stimulating drugs, because now I realize that this is actually a thing. It's not in my imagination, and it's not in the imagination of the doctor. I can resonate with this. I can see how it's acting out in my life. So that's just an example of how we did that, and that's just in the woman's chart. And in the male charts, what I was looking at was Mars as a primary indicator for sperm, and Mars in terms of what are the aspects to Mars and the dignity of Mars. So I was looking at things like, I noticed that a Mars square Saturn or opposite Saturn is men or people who have an issue to do with sometimes authority figures, acting as a handbrake, and where they feel like they just can't get their energy out because something's always pulling them back. And in terms of my fertility, I went, okay, well, that's a motility problem in sperm. That's when your sperm's going to have like enough sperm, but they're not going to be swimmers for some reason. And that started becoming true. And then I looked at Moon with hard aspects to Mars in men, and that became like a signifier for morphology issues. And what I found really interesting with talking to women about their partners with sperm issues is that sperm gets reproduced fresh every 72 days. So if you have a chance to change a man's paradigm about his emotional feeling about his Mars or his energy or his possible emasculation issues due to the Mars-Moon conjunctions or hard aspects, you could actually change that fresh part of sperm. And it has happened more than a couple of times in my practice that from one round to the next round of IVF, things have changed dramatically in a sperm test. But it is also, funnily enough, noted by Robert Winston in his book Infertility, where he told somebody to change their lifestyle, adjust their diet, but also go for therapy or something. And what do you know, the next batch of sperm was was different. And so it's not uncommon, and it hasn't been, how can I say, it's not been well written up, because I think it's one of those sort of softer psychological issues that IVF specialists are not focusing on, but it is possible.
Okay. Let's back up a little bit and just assume listener has no background whatsoever in the topic of like fertility or even having children, and start from square one. So I like that stat you give that 1 in 6 people have problems. One of the things you emphasized at the beginning of your book is that for most people, having children is a lifelong aspiration or even a career goal, really, something about their overall life direction and sort of destiny that they want to accomplish. And most people have an assumption all the way up until the point they get there that it'll be something relatively easy, that it's just like something you do and then you have children, but that it's not supposed to be like a problem. But some people get to that point and then there's a stumbling block for various reasons. And there can be a whole host or a whole variety of different reasons that people run into issues.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be great if, all 16-year-olds came to see me and we could map out their fertility then, and they could, take it forward. I think it's true that the reasons that people want to have children are varied, and I have no judgment on any one of those reasons. Sometimes you'll get a newish marriage, but a marriage that is not necessarily working out that well, and the couple, predominantly the woman, will assume that if we just had a child, things would get better. If we just had a child, he'd be more committed to the relationship. He would, find meaning. He would whatever. And we all know that actually having a child just kind of will highlight the problem in a marriage. It won't actually fix the problem. But that still doesn't stop me from helping somebody having a baby. I'm just noticing that that's one of the reasons. Another reason is financial or material security for women. If they have a baby with a man, they often figure out that this is a way to at least have children that are going to be materially sorted out by someone else. There are people who have children because my mother's dying and she hasn't had a grandchild yet, and I'd like to give her a grandchild. They don't necessarily think of the consequences of, well, then the child's going to be yours for the next 21 years. They're doing it to please the parent, and again, I have no judgment. It's these are the reasons, and I don't think that that people logically think about, I want to have children. I think one gets in a grip of an emotional storm, and you suddenly decide, for whatever reason, now is the time, and you justify it by a whole lot of other reasons. But I think it is very compelling for women, especially because they know that after the age of 36, their fertility drops off a cliff.
Okay. So yeah, there's like a timing issue there where
for men there isn't. Before
menopause? Or before, what is the time frame? You said, is it 36? Is it getting pushed out a little bit more at this point, or?
Well, medical science is fantastic. So what can happen is that, you can have a baby on your own up until the age of 36, 37. People start having problems at 37, particularly with ovarian reserve and with hormone levels. So they're getting into that premenopausal stage. But one statistic is, if you are trying to have a baby at the age of 40 or 41, even with IVF, you have a 1% chance of success, even using your own eggs, even using IVF, a 1% chance. So that's very, very small.
Wow, okay. Once you get to 41?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what happens then is that people will decide, okay, having children is a deal breaker for me. I want to be pregnant and I want a live baby in my arms. They will negotiate with the gods, the fates, and the doctors, and they will use donor egg. Now, using donor egg gives you then an extended fertility till the age of about 45.
Okay, so the issue is that by 36 and afterwards, there's a lack of eggs from the mother?
Yes.
Okay, but then one way around that is to get a donor egg fertilized and then implanted?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how you can do that up to, what did you say, 45?
45. So some clinics will do up until 50, but it just depends on the clinic. These scientists are very clever. They don't want older women in their clinic because they skew their lovely data. So they don't want to post too many unsuccessful IVFs. So you have to find yourself a doctor who's going to be willing to take you on after the age of 45, which is difficult, but they are there. But most countries have got a legal cutoff where if you have an embryo that is still sitting in an IVF clinic somewhere at the age of 49, they will ring you up and say, if you don't plan to use this embryo, we are destroying it. Usually they will ask if they could use it as an embryo share to give it to somebody else. If somebody needs it. Usually it's altruistic, there's no money involved. But however, at the age of 49, you will get that call if you have embryos stored somewhere.
Okay. And that's interesting time frames. I mean, I'm trying to think of different planetary transit cycles that coincide with some of this. Like I know the Uranus opposition is famously around 42 or so.
Yeah.
So we're talking about that time frame roughly as a cutoff.
You're also talking about a Neptune square Neptune at 45.
Okay. And
that's the hormonal endocrine change. That's the start of the perimenopause, and that's when the endocrine system does kind of break down. Also, I think you're reaching the end of your Jupiter Fedaria at about 50.
Okay.
So Jupiter as the planet that does bring babies and things, I think that's the end of that Fedaria.
Yeah, I think you said in your book that Jupiter really is one of the primary, especially in terms of transit indicators, things that you pay attention to and try to focus on for possible time frames of having a child.
I do. So, but also I must say that nothing in my fertility work, I can't even look at a solar fire transit list without knowing what is the almuten of pregnancy. So for me, that's a fundamental tool that I got from Omar of Tiburas, which says if you're going to ask about pregnancy, there are 7 things that go into you getting pregnant, and one is, it's your physical body. So that's the ruler of the ascendant. But it's also the degree of your ascendant. And then we're going to look at the moon and the position of the moon and the position of Jupiter. So he had 7 points that he really looked at in a complicated algorithm, which gave you the almuten of pregnancy.
So that's 4. What are the other 3?
So it's the ascendant, the ruler of the ascendant, the degree of the ascendant, the ruler of the moon, the degree of the moon, the ruler of the fifth house cusp, Jupiter, and then you have to look and see, is there a planet that is bodily in the 5th house? And they get an extra 5 points just on top. And then we're using, obviously, 5 points for rulership, 4 for exaltation, 3 for all 3 triplicities, 2 for term, and 1 for face.
Okay, so your primary access point, and one of the unique things that you did with your book and your approach that you developed compared to other approaches, because I know you mentioned one earlier, fertility astrology book where you weren't crazy about the technique that was proposed there, but one of your unique things is determining the almuten of pregnancy. From the 8th century, 9th century astrologer Omar Tabari. And then that will help you in order to identify what the primary significators of pregnancy are in the person's chart.
Yeah, so once you know the almuten of pregnancy, basically what you're then going to be looking at is how is it placed in the chart by dignity, and what is its ability to act, and what other aspects to it. So this is where I'm kind of a hybrid, where I'm staunchly medieval, but yeah, if that almuten of pregnancy's got a conjunction to Pluto, I'm not going to look askance. we have to look at that and go, okay, so this is an issue. Often the almuten of pregnancy will be conjunct a planet like Uranus, which means Uranus for me is a planet of IVF. It's surgery and innovation and advanced techniques, if you like. So when the almuten of pregnancy is contacting Uranus by aspect, it's not a bad thing. I'm going, okay, so the way in which you're going to get pregnant is like this. It's not going to be, we're not saying it's a no, we're just saying this is the method by which you're going to get pregnant. Sometimes also if the almuten of pregnancy is in detriment, it often indicates that you are going to get pregnant out of the mainstream, according to like a Bernadette Brady quote in her medieval course. So it's out of the mainstream. And that can be, you're going to get pregnant with somebody out of wedlock. You could be pregnant with somebody out of your tribe or out of your age group, or something will be weird and wonderful about how you're going to get pregnant. But it also could be that your pregnancy is going to be, or your fertilization is going to be in a petri dish, which is also out of the norm.
Right.
So paying attention to that, like you would normally on using your normal regular astrology, you can then rate the ability of that almuten of pregnancy to perform in the chart. And then obviously I look at perfection. And you want to see that if the perfected house is ruled by the almuten of pregnancy, then you've got a very good chance of getting pregnant that year. If you've got a perfection, but the almuten of pregnancy is aspecting the ruler of that perfection, you've also got a good chance. So it's about linking those two now and saying, and lastly, I always go lastly to transit. What is Jupiter doing? Is Jupiter going to be helping you with that perfection? Is it going to be transiting either the perfection ruler? Is it going to be transiting the almuten of pregnancy? What is it going to be doing? And I want to see when I'm writing up my notes. So I just take a small little highlighter and I go, oh, that's a nice little moment. And then I go these big highlights where the almuten of pregnancy is highlighted by solar arc in a specific way. And you'll see my notes that most people only have 2.5 to 3 times a year that's lucky to conceive. And that kind of is corroborated by the medical fraternity. They also agree that if you put 2 20-year-olds in a room and they have sex every day, they only have a 15% chance of falling pregnant in that month. So if I extrapolate that, which I once did with Christian Borup in some weird after party algorithm, we figured out that actually if we're using Jupiter, you're getting 17%. So we were looking at Jupiter to the angles and to the luminaries, and you're going to get that. So so we think, okay, three times a year is when you're going to have a highlight or a chance. For me, the wonderful thing about the almuten of pregnancy is that sometimes it's Saturn or sometimes it's Mars, and that could be like disturbing for somebody when you're talking to them and you say, your almuten of pregnancy is Saturn. What it means is that you've actually now just converted one of your malefics into a benefic. So you've actually halved the ability for the malefics to rain on your parade and ruin your fertility, because instead of not wanting Saturn in your 5th house, if the almuten of pregnancy is Saturn, you want it all over your 5th house. So what tends to happen with those women is they get double the chances, because you have Saturn and Jupiter and Venus slightly to bring those pregnancies. So that's really good. And the same with Mars.
So that brings up a point. One of the points you focused on in your book is how, something needs to be promised usually in the natal chart in order for it to manifest in a person's life, and that not everybody's birth chart is created equal, just as everyone's life is not created equal, and different people experience luck or hardship in different parts of their life, which practically, normally speaking, just seems sort of random and chance-like in our lives. But through the lens of astrology, we see that there's some patterns to this, and some of that can be seen in the birth chart, the areas where sometimes people struggle more or run into more challenges versus have greater ease. So there's some people, similarly, when it comes to the issue of pregnancy and having children, that it's something that comes much more naturally or with ease. And there's other people that do run into issues. And sometimes there's indicators of that in the birth chart itself.
There are. And there are traditional ones. It'll be, a moon, for instance, a moon in a woman's chart that's really besieged and hammered. You look at that and you go, not only are you battling like a psychological patterning, perhaps, or a childhood drama, overlaid on that, has it stomatized in the body, and they now have low ovarian reserve. Is the moon now been aspected by Neptune and it has chromosomal integrity issues? So there are indicators where it's going to be more difficult for other people. And
sometimes that can be, you mentioned in the book, sometimes it can be a physical issue that can be an impediment to getting pregnant, and other times it can be a psychological issue.
Yeah. Okay. And sometimes, charts are very strange things. So I'm dealing with 2 charts mostly. So I'm dealing with a husband or another woman, depending on what kind of arrangement I'm looking at. But in the partner's chart, we don't partner and then want to have children with people randomly. We tend to have some severe sort of karmic attraction with these people. So sometimes I will see that there's a terrible signature called killer cell. And I hate the term, but it's so colloquial, it needs to be said. It's called killer cell. It's basically an immune disorder whereby you might get pregnant, but the fetus might not implant, because the woman's body determines that the fetus is a foreign body and then rejects it.
The immune system attacks it, or?
The system attacks it. Okay. So sometimes you'll get a woman who comes to you and she says, I've had 3 IVFs. We've had grade 1 embryos every time and my hormones are fine. We keep implanting, nothing happens. And you see that the husband will carry a Neptune square Mars. And you go, it's not in her chart, but he's carrying it for her. So between them, across those charts, you're going to kind of like see them as one system that they're going to be experiencing, coming into contact with, or having an issue with autoimmune diseases, which could be causing the fetus not to implant. The fact that it's not in her chart and she's the one carrying it is immaterial, it seems. Sometimes we get a real crossover. Other times I'll see like a dead or a dull spot in a woman's chart by transit, but the husband's having like a massive solar arc Venus to his sun. And I said, do the treatment then, and the treatment works because both people are combined. So it's about addressing those charts. But I just wanted to say, also that, Chris, this is the problem, I think, with fertility astrology, is that we cannot blindly apply medieval astrology without holding the space that medical science is advancing and is absolutely fantastic in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking that we keep having, we have a commentary on the quality of time. That's our contribution.
Right.
They have the ability to do the mechanics and to do that kind of setup. And I think it's really important to leave a bit of space. So and I'll never say never with somebody because you don't know what medical science is going to come up with. We've had uterus transplants. Can you imagine? You could look at somebody and you can say you have no uterus, and 5 years later they'll come back and say I've had a uterus transplant and a baby. It's remarkable what can happen.
Yeah, so that's a core point, is that you use astrology, and that was a really powerful thing you said in the book, was that astrology is like an additional tool, but it's not the only tool. Really, it's just supposed to be used as something additional on top of every other medical and psychological and other thing that can be done in order to help a person to conceive a child or to have a child. But the one thing that's unique about astrology, and the strongest thing that you're able to bring to the table as an astrologer, is that astrology is able to address the issue of the quality of time and the better times to do something where success may be more likely, the chances may be more likely, versus times in which things might be a little bit more challenging.
Exactly. That I think that is like the best that we can hope for using astrology in this instance. I also want to add that I think it's really important. Couples go through such a lot when they go through IVF. They have to make so many decisions, and these decisions are so expensive. It's £5,000. I don't know what it is in dollars to have one round of IVF.
Yeah,
and now,
I think that's about $5,000 at this point. They're parities.
And now you're going to ask a couple who are under severe psychological strain. You're going to ask them to make a decision about when they're going to have their IVF treatment. Now, one of them somebody has to take leave from work, and somebody's got to be injected for 14 days at a stretch. The investment is great. So somebody chooses the date and then it doesn't work out. Now we've got to go for round number 2. Now we've got to choose who's going to choose round number 2? There's, whether you like it or not, there's always going to be that sort of subliminal blaming and, well, you chose last time and it didn't work out. Whereas I always say, use me as an ombudsman. Blame me if it doesn't work out. Let me choose when you're going to have your cycle and protect your relationship.
So it's a hugely financially draining process. It's also hugely emotionally draining on the couple or on the mother. And that's one of the things you say in the book, is that by the time somebody comes to you, they're usually at last resort at this point because it's not working. And this has been a hugely trying and almost sort of traumatic process that they've been going through in trying to achieve something that's become very difficult for them, quite by surprise or opposite in many instances to their expectations.
Yeah.
What else? So besides the financial drain, what's involved in the emotional or physical drain?
Okay, so just the process of being hormonally stimulated means that for 8 days in a row, you have to be injected both in your butt and your tummy. And sorry, this conversation can get quite technical.
No, please.
And graphic. And so some couples, they choose like a cheaper option, if you like, of IVF, where they plan to do the injections at home without going to a clinic, which means often that the husband has to inject the wife, which is traumatic. I mean, who wants to be doing that?
Right.
The injections are not, they're not comfortable. Sometimes they're painful. So for a couple of days, 2 weeks in a row, you're going to be making your wife like experience pain in order to do this. And
right. It's not like a sexy process.
There's nothing sexy going on.
Yeah.
And you're going to see her with bruises. And then you're going to go to be scanned, and then you have to watch a doctor like intravaginally scan her, which is really fantastically emasculating and also makes everybody very vulnerable. And then they decide, okay, we're going to have more of a stimulation where we're going to try and either hold off the ovulation in order to fit in with the laboratory scheduled hours, because you don't want you ovulating too soon or too late. So you have these wonderful injections right into your stomach, which cause massive bruising. And then you finally they'll call you in for egg retrieval, and then you'll go in and have your eggs retrieved, which again is not comfortable. So husbands, like, they battle. They not only are they paying for this, but they're seeing their wives in discomfort and pain. And a lot of men don't have a vocabulary to deal with that. They don't know how to reassure their partners without feeling completely lost and vulnerable, and they're too scared to show emotion in case they completely lose it, and then they don't know what they're going to do with themselves after that. So you see them rather not saying anything at all, and the women the women tend to be split into two camps, and there are some women who want their husbands to hold their hand through everything, and it's, if I'm going to be in pain, he must be in pain kind of scenario. And then there are the other women who I think are the more strategic, and they're saying, don't come to the appointment with me. I'm going on my own or with a girlfriend. And they go and have all the painful injections on their own, and they don't let their husbands see that part of them. But their husbands are more likely to pay for a second and a third round of IVF if they haven't been through that painful experience of seeing all that pain and discomfort.
Okay.
So it's a huge dynamic that couples go through.
So it's like the mother is going through like major emotional and physical turmoil, and I'm sure that may be showing up in her transits at that time. So that's something you need to be prepared to understand as an astrologer in terms of what you're seeing or looking at. And then there may also be major tensions in the relationship at the same time for various reasons because of how grueling this whole process is.
Exactly. So sometimes when I'm looking at like a transit, my transit printouts from Solar Fire, I will see things like there'll be a Uranus sextiling the ascendant. There'll be a Uranus sextiling maybe the almuten of pregnancy by transit. I'm going, all good. This is all good. This is IVF. This is telling me IVF.
Medical, technological invention or innovation happening. Yeah.
And I might also see Neptune square the ascendant, or Neptune active in the chart. I'm also, in that particular instance, I'm not using Neptune as a grief marker or as loss or as infection or however else Neptune is usually described in other medical situations. Mm-hmm. I'm just going, these are the hormones. These are the hormones that she's taking. This is the stimulation. This is what's happening. So I'm not troubled by Neptune. I'm definitely not troubled by a bit of Saturn square Venus, and I'm definitely not troubled by a bit of Pluto square the moon, because Pluto square the moon is what I call it the IVF rape. So when you go and have your egg transfer, that's what it really feels like. It really feels like you come out like you've been punched. So it's those kinds of transits that don't worry me. I see that and I go, no, this is all part of the story. You see, I'm all about the story. The transits must tell a story. The story must be chronological. So I don't want to see the Neptune before she's starting the IVF. I want to see the Neptune as part of the IVF or after. And so you're following the story. I'll tell you, the only signature that absolutely terrifies me and that I really, really don't like is when we have a Saturn square Neptune or Neptune square Saturn by solar arc or transit. That is the one thing that really bothers me. That is my biggest miscarriage marker. So what I will do is I will advise people to delay their implantation so you can have your egg retrieval, but then do your implantation after that transit. I also don't like eclipses. So I don't like eclipses in the 4 weeks after implantation. Something seems to happen.
As an electional issue in general, like avoiding eclipses for the implantation, or does it matter if they're like, for example, eclipses in the 5th house I've seen sometimes be if somebody has children?
It's not necessarily even if they're in the fifth house. So my kind of, and this is where it's more like I've just been tracking my charts, and it's more like a feeling that I see when people get pregnant. I don't know, say at the beginning of September, and there's an eclipse in the first week of October. Then it's at around 6 to 8 weeks that the heartbeat comes in. So you might well get pregnant, but it's kind of now we're stepping into sort of Plato's idea of the soul. That soul is now coming down through the ethers and the levels of all the planets, and it's going to be deposited on Earth by the moon, and there's an eclipse. It's almost like the bus with the souls has a crash. For me, it's like there's an obstruction to those souls coming in.
Sure. So that's one of the other, I guess, things we haven't gotten into yet, is that one of the other obstacles to successfully having a child for some people is miscarriages along the way, either when they're trying to have children naturally or even during the process of doing IVF?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's about just avoiding. So those are the two things I avoid, is the Neptune square Saturn and Saturn square Neptune, and eclipses too close to the 6 to 8 weeks when the heartbeat's coming in. I don't mind it if the heartbeat has been in or established for 4 weeks and then there's an eclipse. That's fine, and it doesn't seem to matter if you do your implant sort of a week or even days after the eclipse. It's just that eclipse during that time seems to be sensitive in my charts.
Okay. And one of the things that you mentioned was like the life narrative, because one of the things that you're looking at is you're trying to establish how does this fit into the person's life narrative up to that point, and you want to see things that seem to fit into what they're hoping for astrologically in terms of the narrative that they want to achieve, which is having a successful pregnancy at this point.
Yeah, so some of the things that are really interesting is that women often get like some kind of activity or something going on in their 10th house or in the 10th house cusp, because your 10th house as a woman is your social identity, if you like. So that's reflected in whether you're single or married, or your job title if you have a career. But it's very much those changes get made when children are arriving. So, and also people have to leave their jobs. So often when I see Saturn, for instance, come into the 10th house, I get quite excited. I go, oh, we're going to lose your job. Fantastic, because that means you're losing your job for the reason of pregnancy. So I want to be clear that I only focus on the pregnancy. I'm saying if there are other reasons why you could be losing your job, you need to tell me. But if one of them could be that you're going on maternity leave, well, this is good. This is right. Telling the story. Giving
something up in order to do something else.
Yeah. And similarly, things like Pluto on the 4th house or Saturn even on the 4th house, you go, oh, renovations, somebody, applying for permits to increase, or are you moving house? Saturn on the ascendant is also all those kinds of legal documents like applying for new passports, birth certificates, trust funds. All of a sudden, especially with the men get a Saturn to the sun, and men get Saturn to the 8th house cusp often, because it's all those, okay, so here's another bank account for the baby, or here's another. In their minds, they're already setting up a financial structure going forward for something. So you want to see that. When you see that, okay, so firstly, when I do see people, I like to know what's going on in their lives, because I say to them, I don't really want you planning a huge publication of a book at the same time that you're intending to get pregnant without letting me know, because sometimes Jupiter will give, but it'll only give here and it won't give there. So I think the reason why I am quite successful in my prediction of pregnancy is because I'm typically only looking for one thing. Mm-hmm. I'm not being expected to interpret and find out and predict 5 things. I'm only going for one. So I say to people, be quite clear that this is the thing that you're going for, and streamline your life so that you're orientating yourself towards this, because then you have more success at getting it.
Right. That makes sense, because there's so many. When you're doing astrology, it's one of the major obstacles to predictions is that there can be multiple threads or like a nexus of important events in a person's life at important turning points. And the astrologer may look and see some timing indicator that they think is going to mean something or some type of event, but it could be a secondary event that occurs at that time in the person's life.
Exactly. And It's not the astrologer's fault. It's just that the person has got these multiple streams of focus.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's probably more of, especially an issue in modern times, where more women are able to push pregnancy later because they are trying to pursue careers and make major career achievements before they are ready to sort of like sit down and have children.
A really interesting study would be, and I think Wendy Stacy might have done something in this area, that, since 1965, Caesar births became very popular. Caesarean births.
Yeah.
So when we're having now, in most, we could say that, yes, like in first world countries, Caesar births are the choice. So what you're going to have, obviously, is you're going to have a predominance of people who are born with 11, 10, 9, maybe 8th house sons, because that's going to be the operating times of doctors that fits in with their lifestyle.
Yeah, our doctor, I interviewed her in a previous episode, and she said they tend to schedule it during business hours, so you have this sudden shift in preponderance of people that were born during the day, basically, instead of at night.
Yeah. So one of the, I have to run it through Jigsaw once, many years ago, I ran about 2,000 of my charts through Jigsaw, and the common denominator amongst all of the female charts was a luminary, the sun or the moon in the 10th house. So that just randomly, it doesn't matter what moon or what sun. And what that told me was these are people who have a desire to be out there in the world and to be a cog in society. The meaning in their lives is to be out there in the world and not at home having children. And so they delay things. They become part of a corporate lifestyle. They earn their own money. And then what happens is they marry, but they've bought houses jointly, but they've never had to justify their purchases to anybody. And that the loss of financial independence, or the fact that you now have to hand over practically your fiscal life to somebody else for a period of time, makes them vulnerable, and quite honestly is often the thing that stops them getting pregnant. And they will often self-sabotage in order not to get pregnant, in order to say, I tried, but it didn't work. So I just find it interesting that we need to find a way where it's not considered unattractive for women to ask their husbands how they're going to be protected if they do get pregnant. Not to ask, what is your will? Do you have any debt that I don't know about? And by the way, you're going to need to put 10 grand into my account without asking as an allowance, because I'm not asking you for money for, things, toothpaste. So it's until we sort that out, and until we kind of realize that we're asking somebody to give up such a lot that that needs to be considered. I think, that's going to be, it's very hard for the 10th house luminaries.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And there's just so many different factors that you have to take into account as an astrologer that some astrologers may not be prepared to, if they haven't gone through this or if they don't know all the nuances. But it's something that you really started seeing all the different possible variations of different ways that people approach, or different scenarios that come up during the context of having children for different people, and how wildly different it is, but how you have to be able to identify what that looks like in the birth chart.
Yeah, but I think all astrologers do that. All astrologers have to assess their client in terms of whatever it is they're asking, whether it's career or not. You have to, where are you in your life? What were your expectations, and what did your parents expect from you, and why are you still seeking approval, and all of those things. My job often is to just be very common sense like, and to say to people, what are your expectations of your relationship? Do you know that it's going to get worse, not better initially? And mostly asking men, what are your expectations of mothering? And you'd be surprised. Some people think about it a lot, and some people don't think about it at all. And I think that when people go to an IVF specialist to get pregnant, the IVF specialist has got no remit. They are legally not allowed to ask you about your nurturing experience with your mother. They are not allowed to ask about financial inequality in your relationship. They've got 15 minutes with you in order to get your eggs and scan you and get you out of their office. That's it. But when you come to an astrologer, because of the lack of regulation, ironically, we are allowed to ask anything. We can go anywhere. And so my doctors who work with me, and I work with a few doctors all over the world, they love getting patients with me. They say they are so efficient. They come in, they know what to expect. They've had their God chats, because that's another thing we can get into quickly. They've had their God chats. They know what to expect physically. They know when they're going to have it, because I've done their charts with them. And my doctors are so supportive that they will stimulate the hormones according to the astrology charts that I give them and accommodate what they want to have happen.
Right. So you're trying to bring a more almost like holistic approach to the entire process. Would that be a right way of phrasing that?
Yeah. But what I'm saying is from our point of view as astrologers, we are uniquely placed to be able to do that. I'm sure that doctors would love to discuss more things if they had the time, but they're actually not allowed to.
Yeah, well, because you're looking at the person's chart, which is giving you unique insight into the life narrative as a whole, and it's bringing in components and background that you're able to then see and investigate more from the person's background and ask them questions about and have a dialogue about in order to sort of establish what their life narrative is. Yeah.
I just want to get back onto that God thing, like I said to you before, because I think this is quite important. Some people, if you've never experienced IVF and suddenly you realize, okay, we're going to have IVF, one of the questions that comes up for people is, are we not playing God? Are the doctors playing God?
Right.
And for some people, this is disturbing and it is contra to their religious beliefs or whatever held faith issues that they have. So what I always say to them is, with IVF and with most things, is that medical science can prepare you. So we can take out your eggs. We can fertilize your eggs outside of your body. We can create an embryo. We can then put that embryo back in. But it's the implantation that counts. And that's when the window for God to speak is still there. Because you can't force an implantation. And you can't film an implantation. And conception has never, ever been filmed and cannot be predicted. And so it's a very, very sacred moment. So even if you're using IVF, you're still setting it up and something else has to speak. So it's a nice way to get people around the God issue.
Right. And similarly, as an astrologer, that's probably important in terms of setting expectations and the limitations of what you're able to do, even if you're able to give somebody an edge or an advantage in terms of the timing potentially, or to see timing periods coming up that might be more successful than others, there's still limitations to what you can actually accomplish. There are, and I always say to my clients, I cannot give you a 100% guarantee because it's your body. I don't know what you're eating. I don't know what exercise you're doing. I don't know what your home environment is like. I don't know what the doctor's good fortune is going to be on that day. I don't know whether the lab technician is going to be hungover. There's so many variables that I can never, ever give you 100%, but I can give you the best timing. I can give you the best potential. I can give you the luckiest, window. And that's about it, to maximize your chances. And so managing expectations then is probably a little bit of something that's necessary or something that you need to do in that process. I do, and I always do. That's the first thing. It's part of my little intro caveat. You do know I'm not a medical doctor. And so I tell everybody, I want them to nod their heads, because when we start going into, astrology used to be part of medicine. And when we start talking about the predispositions in the chart, it sounds very medical. And I want them to understand that I'm getting this from their astrology, not from some kind of weird medical background that I have. And then I say to people, if you haven't actually thought about investigating this, maybe it's useful if you do. So sometimes what happens is that I'll pick up a thyroid issue that they haven't investigated, and that thyroid issue then can be sorted out, and then their fertility can continue. But their fertility was never going to be a success if they hadn't addressed the thyroid issue. So it's still important to have the conversation and to say these are general predispositions, and it's almost like your astrological DNA. You might be carrying a marker for diabetes because your families are full of diabetes. So everybody in your family's got Venus square the moon, but it could be contributing to your infertility, in that there's an insulin issue, which is giving you polycystic ovarian syndrome. So, and the funny thing is that most people kind of know, and they go, I knew I should have had that test. I know that something's not right. It's at that moment where you go, oh, yeah. And because it's somebody that's outside of the situation, and it seems to be random, it's got that random feel to it, that's when people notice and they do something. Yeah, and that's always one of the most important experiences with astrology, is oftentimes when you're sitting with a client, there's that experience of telling people something that they already know about their life or they've already experienced, but it's something that they've normalized or taken for granted, and hearing it from an external, like third party, from a stranger that should have no background on the person's life, and having it reflected back in that way, just through looking at the chart, is an important and maybe the most important part of the whole process of doing even just a natal consultation on its own. So it sounds like that's like a piece of it, is just the sometimes mirroring back something a person already knows about their life, but they're not really fully taking into account, or they're not doing something about.
Exactly. Exactly. But it also, it deepens the trust that they have with you. And then what I always find is that, we often get this situation where, so let's talk about Moon-Saturn. So we get people with Moon-Saturn, and they are hard on themselves, and they are sometimes emotionally isolated, and the extrapolation to where you could take that signature is they take themselves there. They go, I don't deserve. So it becomes a case of I don't have because I don't deserve. And so what I say is I've usually tried to establish enough in the chart, enough of a resonance, if you like, or enough of a sort of mirroring where they feel that the next thing I'm going to say is also truthful. So when we get to the point where I say, remember that thing about not deserving, well, your child is going to choose their own chart. And I firmly believe that the birth chart is a lens through which you perceive your life. It's not necessarily your real life. It's the way in which you choose to see it. Mm-hmm. So what we tend to do is we tend to edit out all reality and through the lens of the chart. So I'll say, so long as when your baby comes, they're going to have their own birth chart. And it doesn't matter if you are the perfect mother. If they've got Moon-Saturn, they're going to find something to find fault with. But it's okay, because so long as you've fed them and you've sent them to school and you've been a consistent parent, that's the best that you can do. And the rest is up to them and how they perceive their reality. But kind of the feeling of relief, you can actually see it on their faces. And I say, if I've said anything truthful about you today, it's because you gave me your birth time, date, and place. That's all I have to work with. And your child will come with their own birth date, time, and place. So you'll always be good enough. And it's amazing to see them just relax into that. And I often wonder, sometimes I wonder, is that all it took? Or is it just part of that process? But I just find it a useful conversation to go always to the deserving part.
Yeah, that's a really important point about sometimes it's never clear how much when people describe their relationships with other people, or especially relationships with the parent, and you can see that signature in the birth chart, how much that's reflecting an external truth about how, let's say, the parent related to the child and whatever dynamics the parent actively did, versus how much it's just the child's perception of the parent and their experiences with them that is their own actual subjective experience, but may not objectively be as true if a third party observed the relationship or something like that.
Really good example of this, Chris, is that I have two children, and they were born 20 months apart. And the one sees me as a moon in Leo square Pluto, and the other one sees me as a moon in Cancer. Now, tell me, I can't be both.
Right.
But I can assure you, I'm the hardcore bitch. I'm that Leo moon square Pluto. My elder daughter, she sees me as Mother Teresa.
As the more nurturing type.
And we laugh about it in the family. It's an open thing in the family. I go, how on earth do you see me as this perfect person? Because we all know I'm not. And but she laughs and she says, whatever I need, you give it to me. You give to me whatever I need in that moment. You're just unbelievably there with whatever it is that I need. And I'm going, wow, okay. And these children are 20 months apart, and there's no ways I could have been a different kind of mother. No ways. They had identical sort of bedtimes, routines, lifestyles, everything. So that is one way to kind of, for me at least, to kind of go, yeah, well, this is perception.
I mean, that raises an interesting issue in terms of also that common experience that people say of different siblings at different parts of a family having different experiences of the person because of the order that they were born. Order. For example, like the first child sometimes complaining that they had it worse because the parent was like more uptight or something like that. But then the second child, the parents started to get it down and they like adjusted and didn't make some of the same mistakes or different things like that. It seems like it would partially be tied into that issue as well in terms of that sequence, but that would be something that would be described to some extent in the birth chart, actually, is part of what you're saying.
I think it's the younger one that sees me as the Leo Moon square Pluto.
Oh, really? Okay.
Not the older one. The older one has got, so they each have got sort of my DNA, astrological DNA. So the one has got the Moon square Pluto, and the other one has got the Moon opposite Saturn Uranus. So I've got a Moon conjunct Saturn opposite Pluto Uranus. So they kind of have taken bits and pieces of me. But when I have quizzed them, because this obviously has interested me as a fertility astrologist, like how they have perceived my mothering and my ability to nurture them, it's been just jolly interesting that the older one comes up with the Mother Teresa and the younger one comes up with a much more hardcore version.
Okay. And you've had 2 children, and then this is where also part of your personal story intersects with the topic of fertility astrology, because you did go through some of this process at one point in trying to have a third child.
Yeah, so in 2004, I'd married a very lovely second husband, and he hadn't had children. So I decided to go for IVF. So we did try bits of Clomid. I mean, and this is the other thing, when we talk about...
How old were you at the time?
I was approximately 31.
Okay.
And I'd had 2 children by surprise. And so there was nothing wrong with me. And he had also had a previous pregnancy, which he had terminated when he was very much younger. And so we were typically that couple where it's, 30% of the time it's unexplained infertility.
Right. So you were expecting this to just be easy.
We were expecting to be very easy.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden you're trying and it's just like not working and you're wondering what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but at the same time, I must confess, I went through the IVF process with sort of one eye on the astrology. So I was curious, and I had my whole attitude and brain was wide open to catch and see all the symbolism that I could. While I wasn't in that typical framework of being devastated if I wasn't going to succeed, because my youngest child was actually 12, and that gap was going to be huge, and my life would have been very different. But so we approached this IVF, I think, with a fairly healthy kind of skepticism and a healthy kind of approach of, well, this may not work out. My husband had the South Node in his 5th house, and I always had an eye on that. And I went, okay, there's a certain amount of rejection here.
Natally or by transit?
Natally.
Natally, okay.
And then I also, obviously I looked at my own chart and I went, well, there's so much in my chart that's so paradoxical. So the other thing is that fertility isn't stagnant. So I don't think you can ever look at a chart at the age of 15 and make like a categorical statement about somebody's fertility for a couple of reasons. Again, that person's got to partner up with somebody else, and their chart might speak louder than this chart. So it all depends on who you're having babies with. And secondly, fertility is not static. So it changes. One way in which I could, a technique that I devised to try and describe the changes was to direct the almuten of pregnancy through triplicity phase rulerships, which was something that nobody has done. Went to look for valence and trawled through a number of old texts, and everybody can direct the Arabic part, and they directed the part of fortune, but nobody really has been directing the almuten of pregnancy through triplicity.
Right. And so by that, you mean you look at the 3 triplicity rulers using the Dorothean triplicities of the almuten of pregnancy?
Yes. And then you're making a comment as to, are you going to be one of those people that has children early or later in life? So, of course, instead of, and one should have, but who does it anymore? Please don't tell me you do. I'll feel so inadequate. Calculate the Alcockadon for somebody's length of life.
Right.
Okay, before they come to see you. And then you would divide their life into 3. And then you'd say, okay, in this half of your life, your almuten of pregnancy is more active or more prominent. And therefore, you're going to have your children here or here. we know that obviously you might live till the age of 80, but no one's fertile till the age of 80. So we have to actually condense that sort of period of fertility from 14 to 45. And so I kind of chop it somewhere. And it's not an exact science. I think at about 26, 27 is the first chop off, and then at about 38 is the next chop off. So when I look at somebody's chart, I will direct the almuten of pregnancy, and I'll say, okay, well, if the triplicity phase ruler is in the second half, then maybe you're going to be more likely to get pregnant in the second half of your fertility life. So that's a way in which to look at it. Anyway, when looking at my husband's chart, it didn't look that promising. My own chart was more interesting because I could see that by triplicity phase rulership, I'd moved into a different phase, which is completely explains the phenomena of secondary infertility as a whole. So a lot of people complain that they get pregnant in their 20s, late 20s, and the minute they get over 30, they struggle to get pregnant, and they then spend the next 5 years battling.
It's interesting that just past the Saturn return, basically.
It's a phenomena. Secondary fertility is a phenomena. So there was that. So I did go through that process, and I must admit, much though I would love for astrology to stand on its own, and for men to be fertility astrologers, and for everybody to engage with this. It does relax my patients or clients a lot when I say I've been through IVF, right? Because they go mad. They go on such high doses of hormones that they are literally, they don't know themselves, and they get on the internet and they join these forums, and it's almost like they don't even want to talk to their family members anymore, because as far as they're concerned, their family members have got no idea of what they're going through, which is true. And so they isolate themselves from the rest of the world, and they only really are interested in talking to people with experience. So I'm very glad of that experience, and I'm also equally glad that we weren't successful, because I wouldn't be here today if we were, if that makes sense.
Because you wouldn't have, because why do you say that?
Because I would have had another child, and I would have had to go through that whole process of giving up hobbies like astrology.
Yeah, they would only be turning like 18 or something at this point. Yeah. One of the things that is interesting is the date in which basically you found out that the process had been unsuccessful, right?
Yes.
And I noticed that Saturn was stationing direct, I believe, in your fifth whole sign house and opposing your sun very closely on that day.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting transit in terms of like Saturn transiting your fifth house, having this obstacle come up in terms of being able to have children, going through this long process, but then, and ultimately it being unsuccessful, and Saturn kind of saying no at that time. Yeah.
So what was interesting about that whole time frame is that you don't really... So firstly, Saturn was not my almuten of pregnancy. Had Saturn been my almuten of pregnancy, that would have been happy days. That would have been twins. But Saturn wasn't. Jupiter was. So I think even if I had, and I don't remember clocking it exactly. I don't remember looking at my chart, because remember, I think I was still a very young astrologer then. I hadn't even graduated yet.
And you first started studying with Rod Susskind in South Africa.
Yes.
You're from South Africa?
Yeah.
Okay.
So not so affair with astrology. So I don't think I'd even noticed that. But I must tell you that even if I had noticed that, I still would have gone through the process, because your time frame of success, and I'm kind of always at the edge of like kind of not using the astrology instead of medical science. We can't just dismiss the medical science just because astrology's saying no. What we must do is do the medical science, knowing full well that it might be a no, and manage your expectations. So right. That would have been my attitude at the time had I noticed that Saturn stationing.
That's super important, because there's some people that go through that process and they reach, let's say, a Saturn obstacle in their life at that point, but through much effort and sometimes hardship, they're able to push through it and still come out the other side getting what they want or being successful.
Yeah, I think for me the joyful part of that IVF and its subsequent failure was literally lying in that bed. I mean, I know I present the charts as Nancy and Lisa, and yes, it is my chart. But I mean, can you imagine as an astrologer and you're lying next to somebody and they're going through the same process and you ask them for their birth data and they give it to you, and you quickly rig it up on your phone and you work out that their chart is an exact mirror image of yours. I mean, that was gold. It was like, that was just awesome. It was, and then I also felt so for her because her almuten of pregnancy was Mars, and it was so much more dignified than mine. And it had so many much more beneficial contacts, and later on I found out even better fixed stars. But she had like a little 1-cell embryo. I mean, I had 5-cell embryos. I had loads of perfect looking embryos. And she had this tiny one little sickly thing, and they were just putting it back in because this was the last time they could afford it. And I remember actually lying on the bed next to her, and I remember thinking to myself, you know, this is this double Pisces. I remember thinking, please, if there's a baby, go to her. She needs one. I've got 2 children, go to her. And I remember that feeling. I remember that leaving. And so there's a lot about it that I don't feel any regret or any kind of sorrow that didn't work out, because I think just in terms of that book and what I've done with my life, it's just, wow, that was the reward.
Yeah. So one of the points that you're just saying, that you had a case study of somebody that was born within a year of you with the rising sign the exact opposite of yours. So there are many interesting parallel transits, but she had a better line up astrologically for being successful, and she ended up being successful while you didn't at that time.
Yes.
But that's an interesting, again, it's like Saturn transit that's kind of parallel to, we were talking about Saturn in the 10th house earlier, and a mother that maybe has to give up a career in order to, you know, pursue other life work, having a child at that time. And for you, that Saturn transit through your 5th was kind of like not being successful in having a 3rd child at that time, but this opening up a whole new world to you in terms of you getting much more personal firsthand experience and understanding the whole process much better in a way that you wouldn't have up to that point, and therefore eventually being able to go on and write this book and help lots of other people through this process.
I would definitely say that that's a true reading of it, and not only because my Saturn conjunct my Moon is in the 12th house, and it's sextiling my Sun in the 10th, ruled by Saturn. So I think that, I think I have a tendency to turn hardships into new things, and make it work in a positive way, or at least have a positive attitude. That might be my Pollyanna double Pisces, don't care, still working.
Sure. Or even just having, I think, a day chart Saturn, sometimes in those surmountable difficulties, being a little bit more negotiable sometimes. So a lot of this is taking place in the context, or part of the backdrop of some of this work is medical astrology. And even though you're not a doctor, still having some background in some of the traditional understanding of what signatures mean different things with respect to the body is kind of an important component of this, as opposed to having a purely, let's say, like psychological understanding of astrology.
You know, I can't stress this often enough. And that is, I think, especially, I mean, in niche astrologies like fertility astrology, financial astrology, you know, those astrologies which are focusing on a specific area, I think you can't really do the astrology justice unless you actually know the environment really well.
Right.
So in order to be a financial astrologer, you got to know the stock market, and you got to know exactly how it works.
You got to know finance. You got to know it just as well as you know the astrology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a similar thing happens with excuse me, with fertility astrology. A similar thing happens. You've got to make it your interest and your focus. And luckily for me, I'm supported by some really lovely doctors who have allowed me in certain circumstances to actually watch IVF procedures. So I've been able to, I mean, there's this feeling out there. I mean, every time I say, well, you know, the fallopian tubes are ruled by Mercury, I can see 100 astrologers nodding their heads thinking, yes, because it's a tube. You go down the tube, Mercury travels down the tube. Whereas when I saw it, when I was watching these IVF procedures, all I saw was the doctor is putting like a sperm and an egg, which is like the sun and the moon together in the fallopian tube. The fallopian tube is facilitating a cosmic marriage. That was my understanding, that the fallopian tubes are ruled by Mercury. So it kind of, it really broadened my ability to think on that level, to actually see it happen. And when I saw an ICSI process, and so ICSI is a process where when normal fertilization doesn't happen because the boundary of the egg is too hard and the sperm can't get in for a number of reasons, and we'll talk about that in a moment. What they do is they actually take the sperm in an injection needle and they pierce the outer lining of the egg, and they actually forcibly introduce the sperm into the egg. And so when I saw that, it's like kind of, Mars in a woman's chart. So that's the way that the eggs are going to get fertilized. ICSI. So I say to people, instead of waiting for your second round of IVF with ICSI, because ICSI is always an additional add-on that gets charged for, I said, have ICSI the first time. Don't wait. Just have it the first time. So
right, because Mars symbolically has like a piercing quality.
Yeah. So I've been lucky to have that that support to broaden my medical knowledge and my so that I could deepen that symbolism.
Okay, so that's really important, because you can't just be a good astrologer. You have to know the details of all the different medical procedures and the different scenarios that are involved, so that then you can then develop an understanding of what symbolism that you're looking for and what different things you're seeing in the chart actually look like in real life.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think also understanding, so I broadened my understanding to incorporate medical anthropology, because I think that we need to understand how people regard illness. And for a lot of people, fertility is a disease or it's an illness because it's an aberration from the norm. It's not, for them, it's not normal. It's a condition. And it's about understanding how people respond to that and how they want to. So there's going to be those who fight against stuff. There are those with strong sort of martial elements in their chart where everything is a quest and everything is like in military language. And when somebody's sitting with you and that's their attitude, it's really important to meet them at that place and we talk about a fight. And then you can adjust your language so that it feels like you're on their side in their fight against this. And then there are other people who they first want to find the meaning. Like, what does this mean that I'm not pregnant? Does this mean that I'm unworthy? Does it mean? And then for them, you've got to use a different approach. But medical anthropology has given me like a much more, academic and thoroughly structural framework on which to hang my consultation practice, or the way in which I approach it. And for that, I'm very grateful. Because I also happen to think that we astrologers get very frustrated that other people don't read our academic papers and that other people don't step up and learn more about astrology before they come out and criticize it. But likewise, I'm always conscious of the need for us to actually go and study other stuff in order for us to be able to have a sensible comment on that as well. So I want to see in what way can we contribute to medical anthropology. In what way can fertility astrology form part of their normal lexicon? I want, and thankfully because of Insta and because of the world we live in, astrology is seems to be much more accepted and much more sort of, I don't know, it's getting its own sort of groove again. And I just hope to be part of that kind of serious conversation happening on the side.
Right. Yeah, it's really taken off over the past few years, and much more advanced forms of astrology. 10 years ago, people would know their sun sign, but everybody knows their sun, moon, and rising sign, their big three. And that's such a major shift just in and of itself. But that being said, one of the things that was interesting that you mentioned in the book is oftentimes it's the mother that's approaching you or wanting to come in for the consultation, often or sometimes as a last resort, but then the husband often is like skeptical or is kind of being dragged into it. And some of that famous sort of gender dynamic where for some reason women tend to be, at this point in time, more open to astrology, and men tend to be more skeptical for whatever reason. But that comes up as an issue sometimes for you in the consulting room, since it's often couples coming to see you. It
does come up. And so my approach to that is to firstly, there's nothing more depressing than a fertility consult. So I often say to people right up front, I say, you know what, guys, when you put down the Zoom call, I want you to understand that today has been about looking for problems as to why you're not getting fertile. This is not a normal astrological meeting. And normally we would talk about all the positive things in your chart, health, wealth, happiness, and it would be quite bright and sunny.
Right, because they're coming to you with a problem.
So I'm looking for the problem, so I'm going to be really candid. I'm a Capricorn, so my bedside manner is a little bit straight and to the point. Mm-hmm. But I also have got enough Mercury and Sag that I actually use humor, especially when I'm trying to relax a couple where I see that the guy is a little bit nervous and he's not sure he wants to be there. I start talking about her chart and in slightly like...
You're doing like a stand-up routine or...
conspiritual kind of things.
Okay.
I know why you feel this way because, it's she does this or she does that. And I'll gently make like a light issue. And those girls don't mind that you slightly having a giggle at their expense because they understand that you're making their husband comfortable. And once I start getting more and more accurate about her and the chart and how their charts work together, they relax because this isn't about blame. And I often say, you communicate like this and she communicates like that, and neither of you are going to change. So you don't have to go off and do work. You just have to understand that this is what she means when she says this, and this is what you mean when you say that. And instantly they realize, these skeptical men, that there's nobody's pointing a finger as to who's infertile and why. It's just, this is the deal. So I try and at least make people laugh at themselves or at me or be self-deprecating at least once in the interview just to bring it up a bit and also normalize it. Most of my patients say when they leave that they didn't realize how normal IVF was and that they didn't realize how common and that it's okay and that it's going to be fine. They built up a huge thing in their minds about how awful it is and how devastating and what have you. And I just dial it down completely and go, no, it's not. We're just going to do these 3 treatments. We're just going to do it here. This is what it's going to feel like.
Right. And in some of the interviews, for example, on your YouTube channel with past clients, it seems like afterwards there's the husband or men in some instances who were impressed, or once they saw the results, it's just a matter of what works and what helps in terms of the process, and maybe, being more impressed or convinced that there's something to astrology after going through it sometimes when you're able to help them in some way.
I know the couple you're referring to, the wife is actually a research scientist and the husband is a chemical engineer. Mm. And so these are not stupid people. And she was of the kind that she just thought, you know what, I'm going to try everything, and this is the one thing I haven't tried. They tried something like 7 or 8 IVFs, and it didn't work. Mm. And she said, this is the one thing I haven't tried, so I'm going to try this. And I don't care what people think about it or what have you. She was in that completely irrational frame of mind, but she's a researcher, so her mind is always actually open. Ironically, she's not, closed. And he was just trying to keep her happy, but also not terribly closed. He was just going, okay, well, we're doing acupuncture. We might as well do this as well. So they signed up. And then what it gave to them, and in fact, another couple immediately after them also said was, men like a bit of a roadmap. Men like to know what's going to happen when. So if you just give them this piece of paper and say, this is when you're going to have your treatments for the next year, they suddenly relax because they know what they're supposed to be doing. They can organize their leave. And there's none of this, we'll make up our minds on a day-to-day basis. So most men like the fact that there's now a plan, and they like the fact that there's no indulging of any sort of harebrained schemes. So when people come and say I don't have any embryos, I don't have any eggs, but I don't know about egg donation, I'll get them to egg donation as fast as I can because I'll believe that that's their quickest way to getting pregnant. So we don't indulge fantasies. So, and the men are grateful for that. So the minute there's common sense applied and there's a plan, that seems to work for them. The couple that you're referring to, actually, he then started to consult me for the next 2 years. And it was actually in one of the consultations with him afterwards where I predicted their 4th child. So I predicted that they would have a baby, and they ended up having triplets. And then, but in the next 2 years, I said to him about 9 months after the triplets were born, I said, be careful because you've got a very fertile marker in your chart. And he laughed. He said, don't be daft. We had 9 IVFs to have those children. And I said, no, really. And they managed to get pregnant with their son, Ethan, all on their own at the time that astrology, said. So he then actually started studying astrology with Rod Susskind. He, as a chemical engineer, he saw that there is a pattern to this. I think he appreciated the fact that while we might not understand the pattern and we might not have the scientific tools to measure the pattern, who knows about the rays from the planets? He's not really that interested in that kind of thing. He just said, there seems to be a pattern and I want to know more about it. So it's heartening that you can turn somebody around to, but equally, I've had people. I did a research paper recently at the University of Lampeter. I think I published it on academia.edu, and in it I asked 11 people who'd been successful with me what their experience with fertility astrology was and how they thought that they'd experienced it. And there was a lady there who was extremely hostile. She hated me, but she got pregnant, and she had to admit. She said, I hated you for reasons because, I was struggling. I tried everything else that hadn't worked. I didn't believe that it was going to work. I was your worst kind of patient, the one that wasn't going to be compliant. And it worked. And so she said, so I'm a believer in your kind of astrology, but yeah, and I'm sorry I was hostile at the time. So it's not a case of whether you believe in it or how skeptical you are as to how successful you're going to be. It seems to work anyway,
Right. Even if you're sort of reluctant, or even if it's, for some people, it's like a last resort in terms of trying to achieve this.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you... I can imagine, though, there's other scenarios. One of the issues is the astrologer wants to help, and the astrologer wants to be able to, for example, predict good things or make a good prediction, or one that's in alignment with what the client wants. But I'm sure in some instances, sometimes you run into an issue where it looks more challenging, or, you don't want to give a client false hope either. So that's something I know all astrologers struggle with, but it's probably even more pressing here when people want to achieve something specific.
It is one of the difficult signatures that I see in a chart in a woman who has been struggling, or is a Moon-Neptune hard aspect, because that is most often prevalent in my charts that have eggs with a chromosomal integrity issue, which means that there's a genetic problem and that the embryos, there's something not quite right with the embryos. So what tends to happen is that they have many IVF implantations, but they lose the baby before a heartbeat is detected. Some of them don't have the money to do pre-genetic testing, so they're a bit blind. They don't know what's happening. They just know that it isn't working. And those women are potentially already sort of 42, 43. And then you have to say to them, so what is a deal breaker here? Is it a deal breaker in your life to have a baby? And if the answer is yes, that it is a deal breaker, you want a baby more than anything, then I say to them, you have to consider donor egg then. If you don't mind either way, you can carry on trying. But I'm telling you now that with people with this signature or this marker, most often require a donor egg. And it's a hard conversation to have, but they've already been told a lot of home truths. They've already been to a doctor. Most of them know. I kind of refuse to be that person who just says, never mind about what the doctors say, I'll do a spell for you, light a candle, or all be fine. I'm not that person. So it's tell me what your goals are, and I'll align myself and my astrology with your goals. But I can't be I can't be pretending that you don't have serious issues. Yeah. I have had about 3 50-year-old patients, and they've been really challenging. And I've handed them I have got a very lovely doctor that does deal with older women and who's very good at doing the best that he can. But, and the point is to never say never, refer them to specialists who are sensitive and caring and who can help, but also let them know. So what I say, if you are not pregnant by this date, then you must consider that the door is closed. So I give them a time in the future where they don't have to do it in front of me. They don't have to do it in the moment. They can consider it later to be something they need to walk away from.
And one of the things that you do utilize, so in addition to using natal astrology, looking for natal signatures, and also looking at transits or other timing techniques based on the natal chart, is you also employ electional astrology in order to help pick out dates for different parts of the process. Especially, it seems like the implanting is a major thing that you try to some extent to elect.
Okay, so the problem with fertility astrology and any prediction is that you are so squeezed by what's happening in the woman's cycle and the medical fraternity that you have less room to maneuver than you think. So using any timing related to the moon, forget it. I cannot give somebody a day that you have to have your implantation on this day at this clinic. That's not going to work. Because it's just not feasible.
Due to restrictions of scheduling with the clinic and their limited options for availability? Exactly.
And also the woman's cycle. The woman's cycle suddenly goes out, her follicle isn't big enough. They've got to wait a little bit longer. There are so many variables, and the last thing you want to do is stress your patient even more by giving them dates that they can't possibly adhere to. And then they feel like they've missed their one and only chance. So I tend to use really big solar arcs. And I use those solar arcs because then I say to people they are hot to trot a week before and 3 weeks after, which gives them an adequate window for their implantation to happen anytime in those 4 weeks, which means that their hormonal cycle doesn't need to be altered too much. And because it's a solar arc, we know that it's probably got a 3-month window, not just but I'm trying to get them to as closest to that date as possible, but potentially just after. And so that's what we're aiming for. We can't aim for any progression of the moon. We can't aim for, any closer time cycle is really tricky. Transits, I look to transits of Jupiter to the moon sort of before when we're doing the egg retrieval. So if we're doing an egg retrieval, I might say, because egg retrieval and implantation can happen at different times. So if I say, listen, if your problem is the fact that you don't have that many eggs, and you are going to do a frozen transfer, then have your eggs retrieved here because, look, Jupiter's conjunct your moon. Jupiter's not conjunct your moon 6 weeks later when you're having the implantation, but that's okay. You've already got the eggs you need. So I do adjust slightly, but it is difficult to elect. I will never just elect a day for something. And I'll try and avoid eclipses, obviously, and I'll try and avoid the Saturn square Neptunes in terms of having an implantation date. But you'd be surprised that you don't really have much to maneuver with as an astrologer.
Sure. Well, and even some of those broad things that you gravitate towards or avoid in terms of the astrological weather at the time, even over several month time spans, I guess would still count as a type of electional astrology, even if it's not picking the exact day and time?
Yes. Yeah, I would say.
Okay. One of the things that came up in the book is you said with medical intervention and stuff, there's going to be opportunities that are becoming more and more frequent in terms of being able to choose, doing medical interventions in terms of changing genes and stuff like that as a thing that comes up. But it also raised an interesting parallel that sometimes comes up for astrologers, is the question of electing a cesarean birth or having an idea of what the birth chart, roughly speaking, at some point 8 months in the future is going to be for a child, and that almost being a sort of engineering in and of itself to some extent. Does that ever come up as a process, or is that something you've thought about abstractly?
It does come up. So I do often get women coming to me saying, I want a Pisces baby, I want a Leo baby, I want whatever. And you go, well, depending on how much you've been struggling, again, what is the deal breaker? Do you want a baby? Let's be real. And also to say that it's really, really difficult to get that right. And so no, I don't do that, and I don't like the gender engineering either. So there are lots of people and a lot of Indian people come to me and ask me for advice on how to have a girl baby, or picking a time for a girl embryo. I know Vedic astrology and and Jonash actually also, he had some method to determine that, if you had a conception when the moon was in a female sign, you'd have a female baby, and when the moon was in a male sign, you'd have a male baby. But since nobody's been around to even witness a conception, I don't know how that's actually possible to predict.
Right. You brought this up in the book as an objection to some earlier methods on fertility astrology that are kind of out there. But one of the issues is conception, and issues surrounding like when conception actually takes place due to some timing issues there.
Yeah. So I just want to make clear that the Jonash method is terribly elegant in that it wants to suggest that you are most fertile when you repeat the natal lunar solar aspect in your chart.
Okay, so if you're born with
a crescent moon, then you're going to be pregnant or most fertile on a crescent moon every month.
Okay, so that's the theory or the hypothesis?
That's the hypothesis. So, which begs the question now, because I'm saying, okay, so we bleed every 28 days, and somewhere in between, and ovulation can vary quite a lot in women. So not every woman ovulates on day 14. Some women ovulate on day 11, some on day 16. There is a certain amount of variability. We can tell and we can film the ovulation. That's the easy part. But nobody knows. So once your egg has been released from the ovary, it then travels down the fallopian tube. The sperm then travels up through the cervix and into the fallopian tube and comes to meet the egg where they are fertilized in the fallopian tube. It then takes another, and this is the interesting point, up to 6 days for that embryo to come back down into the uterus and to implant in the uterus. So you could have had sexual reproduction on Saturday, but only by the following Friday is that embryo going to come back and implant in the uterus, but nobody can check. It could be sooner, it could be later. So when we're using the Jonas method, I'm going, how does he know when conception happens? There's a 6-day lag, and the moon can move a lot in 6 days. So I'm not sure how he did his paper. I'm not sure how he worked it out, because I don't know what his starting point was. You know what I'm saying? So he was just using sexual activity, and then furthermore he was using reported sexual activity. Now it is my experience with my fertility clients that people lie a lot about when they have sex. So you'll find that somebody will say about, oh yes, and we got pregnant on this anniversary. No, they didn't get pregnant on that anniversary. They got pregnant 2 weeks before, when they had a massive do or die blowout fight and everybody was drunk and disorderly. But they don't want to own that they got pregnant on that night. It's much more nice and romantic to say we got pregnant on this anniversary. So I know that people lie. I'm very realistic about this. But Jonas seems to base his entire data on when people said they had sex. He didn't see them have sex. And then furthermore, there's a discrepancy with the days. So I'm not sure how Jonas can be used in my natural astrology, natural medical astrology. However, I reserve like a little space for Jonas and say, if we're going to use Jonas in horary astrology, then that's a potential, because that's then using it as a completely different divinatory tool. That's no longer natural medical astrology. That's of another order. Then I'm quite happy for people to use it like that. I also think that Jonas was not irresponsible, but again, I don't know how he supports his hypothesis for gender selection on the moon and the conception because of the lag of those 6 days. And because gender selection sometimes is so medically important. I mean, if you have hemophilia in your family and you cannot afford to have a son because your son will have hemophilia, I would not want that on my head to choose an elective date to make sure that they only have female children. So, and I also, again, don't like the engineering part where people don't want female children because they only want male children, like in some Asian countries. I get a lot of requests for that. So I've decided just as a practice policy just not to do that. Also because I can't find an astrology that is watertight enough or that'll give me the confidence to be able to do that. Sorry, and just one issue, and another issue on that thing is most people will also ask me, will I ever get pregnant? They look at my chart, will I ever get pregnant? And I want to go, well, the question is, will you ever get pregnant with this chart? So you must bring me the other chart so that I can see that chart too.
The partner's chart, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's very hard to say, will I ever get pregnant? If you're going to bring me somebody's chart who's totally infertile, the answer is probably going to be no. The other thing is we have spent a lot of our lives as females or couples contracepting. And so if the Vedics, for instance, they've got a very clear black and white understanding of how many children you're going to have. But if you've been contracepting, you might have denied the opportunity for those children to come. So it's a moot point. And it's not one that's easily answerable. So that's another funny little philosophical thing that I often have to spend time thinking about. But I keep coming around to, there's no answer to that, is there?
Right. Yeah. It's sort of similar to the issue of medical intervention being like a new thing in modern times. And sometimes you're saying that showing up with Uranus, transit of just like advancements in technology, changing what otherwise might be the natural order of things.
Yeah, and let's face it, when you have a woman of 45 coming to see you to have a baby, I mean, if I was practicing medieval astrology, she would be looking at grandchildren and she would be possibly going to die soon. You know, this is, we are asking sometimes too much of astrology. And that's why I suppose this book is an attempt to kind of show at least my very basic and rudimentary understanding of how to integrate what's happening now in medical technology with an older astrology, so that we can at least use the older astrology, but we now know how to manage our expectations, or we now know how to make it applicable, as opposed to just something that's on a bookshelf that we can't access.
Yeah, and how to contextualize it, which one of the really great things you were talking about earlier at the beginning of this interview was just talking about the concept of detriment and drawing on Bernadette Brady's statements or interpretations of how in some traditions that's referred to as exile and being away from home, because the planet's literally the furthest from its domicile that it can get by being in the sign opposite to one of the signs that it rules. And then in modern times that you've seen that sometimes manifest in symbolically appropriate ways in that context.
Yes. And quite often in same-sex couples, particularly men who have to have surrogacy, they seem to have a lot of their almuten pregnancy in detriment. And often they are literally using surrogates from across the world, which I've always found so interesting in its actual manifestation. Yeah.
Okay. And then circling back to the conception issue, isn't there a separate issue of like, can sperms survive for like a few days or something like that? And that can cause a delay in terms of when conception takes place?
Yeah. So sperm can last up to about 4 days, depending on the pH of the vagina. So if the pH is very acidic, not so long, but if the pH is more balanced, yeah.
Okay. So there's just a whole host of issues in terms of the traditional concept of the conception chart, which even, I mean, I want to say that was probably rectified most of the time in ancient astrology and was primarily designed in order to study how well the pregnancy itself might go. But there's just a host of like practical issues with trying to come up with a conception chart at this point.
There are. I don't recall the older writers having issues to do with the conception chart. They kind of might have said conception and sexual reproduction were one and the same. Aristotle was the first one who kind of he came up with a weird thing where he said that a boy baby takes 60 days to get a heartbeat and a girl baby takes 40 days to get a heartbeat or something like that. And so, and he also had the numbers down to, you've got a pregnancy of 240 days, and then you have a pregnancy of 268 days. And if it's 268 days, it means this. And so he had various understandings of sort of, I think they were Venus cycles. And he and by the way, he had no problem with termination quickening until about 16 to 20 weeks. That wasn't an issue for Aristotle. But I was really interested in this, firstly, the difference between the 60 days and the 40 days for a male or a female fetus, because I don't think you could possibly tell that. But it does highlight that there sometimes is a lag. So sometimes, women can bleed in the first week of pregnancy. So if you're getting pregnant sort of in the last 2 weeks of the month, or later, you might still bleed, and then he might have assumed that pregnancy was a younger pregnancy. Then she misses her next one, but then he thinks, okay, she's only 2 weeks pregnant, not actually 4 weeks pregnant. So there seems to be like a bit of discrepancies in his understanding. But I just think it's really interesting that he those 60 and 40 days is roughly 6 to 8 weeks when the heartbeat does come in. I'm going, wow, did he hear that? How did he? I mean, he must have. I mean, that's quite something to have witnessed or observed, if you like, it in those days.
Sure, yeah. And I remember talking about conception charts, like Hephaestus of Thebes, for example, has his birth chart, and then he has his conception chart, supposedly, and Valens probably also has his conception chart, but in both instances, they're trying to demonstrate this theoretical concept that goes back to Nicepso and Petasiris, that like the moon at conception, sign of the moon at conception is the ascendant at birth, and vice versa, or something like that. So it's a very like a theoretical concept, which is one of the reasons it makes me think that maybe conception charts were probably just rectified based on that concept mainly, rather than something that was, very more strictly based.
Of course, because if anybody in your family or close to you has been pregnant, we know that the doctor, and with some fairly fancy technology, they can make some predictions as to when you're going to deliver, and according to birth weight, size, and what have you. And very few people actually give birth on the day that they're supposed to. So right. It's really, and with some huge variables, and also due to environmental conditions, again, that you have no control over. So I think the conception chart is a theoretical chart. I happen to know that I was about a month premature, so it makes anything that I look at, I go, well, how do I even approach that? Do I give him this birth date, or do I give him the birth date when I was supposed to be due? So yeah.
Yeah, and that raises a really interesting point as well, which is that with advances in medical technology, children can be born much earlier or more premature and still survive than in ancient times.
This is true, and often, so in the early days, it's not a long time ago, when I was doing Bernadette's medieval course, we were looking at the chart differentia, and basically, I mean, I'm a twin, and although I've got quite a strong high leg, everything else is like super screwed. So basically, because I'm the girl twin, I would have been put out in the wood, and just left. Secondly, I mean, I've got this Moon-Saturn opposite Pluto-Uranus square Mercury-Jupiter, and there was nothing else going in my favor. So I think it's a class 2 differentia chart or something like that. So it's interesting to me that you, and I would have thought that would have had an impact on my health. So I would have thought that having such a differentia chart might have implications for health later on, but it doesn't seem to have been the case for me. And it's certainly, at the time that we were doing that course, it seemed to have some kind of effect on Charlie Chaplin, if I remember correctly, that his differentia of chart meant that there were. But again, it's all about medical technology and the rescues that we can have. I mean, I've had my appendix out. I've had various other little things that might have, complicated the issue and been part of that initial prediction. I'm not sure.
Right. That makes sense. Where are things headed in the future in terms of fertility astrology? What sort of research is coming up? What sort of things, if you had like unlimited time and unlimited research potential, or clients or what have you, would you like to see or like to take it in the future in terms of either your own private work or in terms of where you could see things going with this decades into the future?
Gosh. So, yeah, well, let's just start with Pluto going into Aquarius. So Aquarius being the sort of the Anima Mundi, the 11th house, which is the house of... Yeah,
I was going to say, as an Aquarius rising, let's not go there, but go ahead.
It's the 11th house of the Anima Mundi, and this is kind of my partner's children. So I wonder, I strongly believe that we are going to head into like another Roe versus Wade forevermore scenario, where we are talking about the viability of of life itself, when life begins, the rights of a fetus, the rights of this. So just like just the environment is going to be more about fertility rights is basic, and reproductive rights. I think we're going into, and it's going to be, I don't think less legislation. I think it's going to be more legislation. I'm not sure which way it's going to end up, but anyway, I see that on the horizon, and that means, what does that mean for fertility astrologers? Well, it means that, for instance, they are now trying to shut down, for instance, surrogacy programs in India, with the idea that women in India are being exploited. And part of the problem I have with that is that those women, they are very often women that have been left by their husbands, so they have absolutely no other means of schooling their children, feeding themselves. And for them, this is not a hardship. They consider themselves lucky that they could do this. But the Western first world countries has determined that they are being exploited, so they're shutting down those programs. So if not India, then where are we going to go? So I think those kinds of legislations about who can do surrogacy, how much it's going to cost, and that's going to come into play. And that'll make more and more people desperate, and that'll make more and more people very vulnerable themselves to scammers and exploitation. I think that we are headed for a period where, my children are in their 30s now, and their friends, and at least one of my children has said, well, they're not sure about having their own children. And it's because they see this whole climate change in the world that we've created for them. They're finding it difficult, and they're finding it a challenge to provide for themselves and then to provide for children. And they take the responsibility of having children quite seriously. So they are looking at it quite seriously. So I suspect that we're going to have a lot of people who are going to think like that, and then at the very last minute they're going to come in at 42 and they're going to be phoning me and saying, I thought I didn't want, but now I do. So there's going to be a bit of that.
That's a really interesting thing in terms of people's life narrative, people not wanting children at one stage in their life, but later going through some sort of transit or progression or something and changing their mind and suddenly, wondering if it's too late or if it's still a possibility.
I think every new relationship that one has brings with it like its own sort of blossoming or emerging thing that we do together. So I think what happens is that, especially with this generation of 30-year-olds, they have had it's been very puzzling to me, basically, because old as I am, I think I've had more sex than them. They go to festivals, they hook up, but they don't form relationships. They're very abstemious. They're quite discerning, and they rather operate on quite a shallow level, and they communicate on Instagram. And so as a result, their relationships are very, for me at least, and this is, like I said, I'm either talking a little bit distorted in a way and not really building a future together. So there's lots of options. So there's lots of browsing and scrolling of options, but no sort of like, we're in this together. So I see that until that happens, somebody, when you love somebody and when you've decided to merge your life story, for some people, I'm not saying for everybody, for some people, there is this, it's that ultimate act of recreating oneself or recreating something jointly, which, is all encompassing. And it's how can I say it? It's very seductive. That idea of having a baby is very seductive. And I think that when people are in that space, that's when it's going to happen. But it'll be delayed. So I'm looking at these 30-year-olds and I'm going, yeah, they will wake up and they will find themselves finally in a relationship. But while they're all so young and beautiful and just hooking up and, being, how can I say, non-committal, I see them well able to deny children because their lifestyle doesn't hold space for their children.
Yeah, and you mentioned sometimes being in certain relationships where that's not the case, but then all of a sudden sometimes being in others where suddenly there's a desire to have that. And that's such an interesting concept that you've mentioned a few times during the course of our discussion, which is just different relationships having different synastry and like people's planets falling in different parts of your chart and activating different parts of the chart that maybe a different relationship, didn't activate.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I know several relationships where even just the introduction of a pet dog, for instance, has changes the dynamic completely. It somehow allows people to express themselves more vulnerably or more openly with a dog than they do sometimes in their relationship. So it's that kind of feeling might make people have more confidence. For instance, a lot of people talk about, well, let's get a dog first, then we'll decide if we're going to have children. That's very common. I'm not against it. It's just like, oh my gosh, but when you have children, that dog's going to be a burden because you're not going to have time for walking the dog and the children. But it's, if the dog opens up the relationship space for you to consider that kind of sacrifice, well, then it's a good thing, because sometimes people aren't able to imagine. There's also like a phenomena which I find common. So I know I wax lyrical about the Moon-Saturn, but it is the most common signature for infertility. Sometimes people feel that there's not enough love in their relationship, that they're not going to have enough love for their partner and another. So they feel that the love that they have to give is finite, and they can't imagine that they are able to incorporate it. And it's very hard to tell people, from my side of the table where I've had 2 children, it's very hard to convince them that actually love is infinite. It's unbelievable how you can have this baby and love everybody 150%, even more, even when it's really bad and times are really tough. Is you don't know until you're there about the capacity that you have for that love. But people are so scared and anxious that they won't have enough love. So it's just an interesting dichotomy that sometimes you have to just take the leap of faith and just do it anyway.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting. You've had a chance to see so many different signatures with different couples and have greater insight about where they're coming from with some of the signatures like that and some of the things that they maybe struggle with, not just physically, but sometimes psychologically or emotionally, and in terms of carrying certain family dynamics as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that I always say to people, especially women who want to have multiple rounds of IVF, or they're just starting the journey with IVF, you look at the husband's chart, and the husband has got in Sagittarius, he's got Mars square Uranus, and you just go, or the Sun square Uranus, Moon square Uranus. He's got this deep-seated desire for physical independence. And so what I normally advise those women is I normally say, listen, so long as you can convince your partner that he can be a bachelor for the rest of his life, he'll be paying for these IVFs. But the minute you start saying things, because women can be very funny, the minute they start trying to have IVF, they're going to say, well, honey, you better get used to this, because when the baby comes, you're going to have to do 50% and they start curating a man's time. And people with anything Uranus square, any luminary or Mars, they don't like that. And that's when they want to check out. So when the first IVF doesn't work, they close shop and they say, you see, it didn't work, we're not trying again. And I say to women, just tell them that they can be a bachelor forever. You can nail them once the baby's born, but we're here to get you pregnant. But you're not going to get pregnant if you're going to keep curating your partner's time before the baby's even here. And also, once the baby's here, the partner actually forgets about their independence momentarily, because they've got this whole new thing that's going on in their lives that's new and interesting and has given them, broadened their horizon. So it's a different game anyway. But it is interesting how, people have ideas about what kind of parents they're going to be and whether they can cope and whether they can't. And
right. And in the process of having children, sometimes changing you or people becoming different people than they expected, maybe going into it.
Yeah, there's a lot. Okay, so there's a lot about women with the 10th house luminaries that want to go back to work straight away, and their partners are surprised and hurt because they think that they must now turn into these wonderful mothers that just want to stay at home and bake cookies all day long. And so I always say to them, have the conversation up front where you actually organize a childcare sooner rather than later, because you are going to want to be back at work. And it's not an indictment on the kind of mother that you are, but people need to understand that there are different kinds of mothers, and it's okay. There's that. And there's also a typical thing is also men with Pluto opposite Venus. Often there's a very compelling, intimate sexual relationship with a partner. And men suddenly feel like, okay, now here's the baby coming along and it's interfering. It's already interfering. Sex is also not quite what it was because she's heavily pregnant, and this is another baby's going to be screaming and crying and breastfeeding, and I'm going to feel excluded, and I'm going to feel like I don't have that sexual connection. And for some people, that sexual connection is the very expression of who they are. Could be heavy Scorpios, where that's just what they need. And so it's really useful sometimes to say to the wife, you are actually going to have to make date time for your guy. You're actually going to have to make a real effort to be that person that you were before. And it's not all on you, but it's kind of like you need to understand that this is the thing that actually makes him feel like he can cope with life, and not just dismiss it and say it's just something he needs to get used to. So, and it's about talking that through. Especially, I think men struggle, especially if the child is a boy, and there's feeding going on, and there's denial of sex because of hell, just had a baby. It could feel like your relationship has changed forever, and not in a good way.
Okay. And there's one last thing I wanted to mention that came up in the book that I thought was a really interesting point. But you said something, broadly speaking, about trying to understand one's destiny as a means of trying to control it. And it was kind of like an observation about astrology and divination, I think, in history a little bit, but relevant in terms of understanding a person's life narrative and how much you can exert some control or try to push things in a direction that is more close to what you want to achieve in terms of your ideal future.
Is this a question directly related to fertility astrology or just in general?
I mean, I guess we can situate it in the context of fertility astrology, but it was just a really interesting point for me in general, or like an observation that it's not that I had never thought about, but the way that you phrased it somehow about that part of the purpose for many people of trying to understand your destiny through, let's say, astrology, is that people want to be able to influence it in some way rather than just experiencing it purely passively.
Okay, I think you're discovering my inner Stoic. Actually, my inner Stoic is not so inner. So, yeah. So I'm, being a Capricorn, I'm extremely practical and Stoic. So, but I'm also always looking for ways in which to, I think if you give somebody something to do, or if you give somebody a task to think on or meditate on, they kind of... they take it away with them, and it's something for them to fall back on as just like a talisman to fiddle with or to think about, so that it distracts them from the IVF that they're going through or whatever it is. So when somebody's going through like a really hard, I'm just trying to think in my own chart. I know exactly what I was referring to there. In my own chart, so I've got Moon-Saturn opposite Pluto-Uranus on the 7th house cusp. And I think... I don't know, somewhere in the 2000s, 2006 maybe, we had a transit of Saturn was in Virgo on the Uranus and Pluto, and it was opposed to Uranus on my Moon-Saturn.
Yeah, that your Saturn went into Virgo in 2007?
Yeah. So I had that as a transit. So when you've already been divorced once and you see that one coming up, you're going, okay, don't feel like doing this all again, do we? So the point is to look at that and go, yeah, this could be scary, but let's see what I can do with this. Let's see how I can manage this. And so what I decided to do was, firstly, there was an opportunity for my husband and I to decide to immigrate to England. So I thought, okay, Uranus coming over my ascendant is asking me to physically separate. So I'm going to do this, but I'm going to be in control of it. So I said to my husband, we are going to physically separate. We can even financially separate. I'm going to go to England. We'll continue to be married, but this is the way that I'm going to do this transit. And especially only because Saturn was also in the 7th house. So if it had just been Uranus, I might not have been pushed there. But the fact that there was a Saturn-Uranus opposition, which was the reverse in my chart, I went, no, that pushed me. So I said, this is what we're going to do. And he said, okay, fine. He said, I can see this and this will work. So I immigrated to England. And we started a period of 8 years where we lived apart on 2 different continents. And it was a 6 weeks off, 2 weeks on marriage for 8 years. And we're still married. We've been married now for 24 years. And I firmly believe that had we not done that, things might have conspired differently and I might have just lost my temper, because let's face it, I've got Uranus, Pluto on the 7th house cusp. God knows what I could have done. I could have just bolted, had a tantrum, but I was distracted now with a move, distracted with immigrating to another country. And because we had done the thing and we had separated, I believe, and maybe that's also part of the process, isn't it? Is I believe that this was the best manifestation of my chart at the time. And so nothing further happened.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it reminds me just of some of the old propitiation rituals and things in ancient astrology where there was almost always this core underlying theoretical assumption that the astrological placement or the transit has to manifest somehow. And sometimes the best thing you can do is to try to do something in your life that would be symbolically appropriate, that would also represent that, and that will kind of like soak up that transit or what have you symbolically. And in doing so, you do gain some control over it instead of just completely having some external manifestation that's sort of like pushed on you.
I agree. And actually there's a very, so there is not a trick, but it's something that I tell people. I'm finding a lot of youngsters now coming up with a Saturn-Neptune opposition. And Saturn-Neptune opposition natally must be quite tough for those people, because there's a lot of things, material things that they find difficult to manifest, literally, because of that opposition. And so what I often have advised people to do while they're trying to get pregnant, and particularly if this is across the 5th house or involves the ruler of the 5th house or the almuten of pregnancy, what I try and tell them to do is take up photography, but old school photography. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to capture a moment that is very Neptunian and ephemeral, and you're then going to use Neptunian chemicals and alcohol in order to develop the photographs, but you're manifesting a photograph. And I'm hoping that process is just going to soak up that aspect of your chart and not affect your fertility. So that's kind of the out. So I'm constantly looking at ways of finding activities or things that my clients can do that will, I don't know, enhance the potential for that to be a way to unlock it.
I love that. And that really takes things back to very ancient, like Mesopotamian astrology, and just bringing things that they were doing back then into modern times and doing a variation of that today. So that really sort of brings things full circle here. This is great. Thank you for joining me for this interview today.
Thank you.
What's your website, and where can people find out more information about you?
So I've got a website, which is www.fertilityastrology.com. I have an app, which is called Fertility Astrology on Apple and iOS and on Android. And I have a YouTube channel, and my book's on Amazon.
Awesome. And the book is titled Fertility Astrology, a modern medieval textbook. Yeah. So I'll put a link to your website in the description below this video on YouTube, as well as on the podcast website on the astrologypodcast.com. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, and Mimi Stargazer. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. If you would like to learn more about the approach to astrology that I outline on the podcast, then you should check out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I traced the origins of Western astrology and reconstructed the original system that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And in this book, I outline basic concepts, but also take you into intermediate and advanced techniques for reading a birth chart, including some timing techniques. So you can find out more about the book at hellenisticastrology.com/book. The book pairs very well with my online course on ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has over 100 hours of video lectures where I go into detail about teaching you how to read a birth chart and showing hundreds of example charts in order to really demonstrate how the techniques work in practice. So find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. And finally, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountaiнаstrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for iPhone and Android. You can find out more information about that at astrogold.io.